this conversation about round here, it's really seeking to understand what is it supposed to be like in the church. And I'm going to press harder because I'm going to ask the questions about the church, and then I'm going to ask you to ask those questions about your home. I'm going to ask you to ask those questions about the workplace, the work environment. Any place that you have influence, I'm going to ask you to ask the question, what's it like round here? So, we have this, I have this idea, this guiding principle for this whole teaching series, and it's this. If this church is led by men and women who are filled with the Spirit of God, and if this church has men and women who are serving as volunteers and who are sitting in the seats who are filled with the Spirit of God, and I think that's a fair assumption to make, isn't it? Like, there are at least some people in this church that are filled with the Spirit of God. Is that a fair assumption? Please say yes. It's a good assumption, okay? If it's led by men and women who are filled by the Spirit of God, if they're men and women serving in various capacities, sitting in the seats that are filled with the Spirit of God, we ought to expect that it would feel godly. It would feel like God around here. And so we're asking the question, what's it like around here when we live God's way? When we do God's way, what should it feel like around here? And the answer to that question is found in a letter that St. Paul wrote to a young church in the city of Galatia. It's modern-day Turkey. And he said, when the Spirit of God is living in us, He produces these kinds of characteristics: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, I'm going to be breathtakingly honest here. When I read those words, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, this sounds like something that I want my mom to be. But I don't know, like, can you be a man and be those things? You know what I'm saying? I mean, seriously, think about it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Can you be a man, like a man's man, and very, very serious question here, and be all those things? Because honestly, this sounds like something I would want my mom to be, or a babysitter for my children to be, right? But is it possible to be like a testosterone-filled dude and be those kinds of things? So, I'm reading this and I'm like, you know, on the one hand, it sounds very metrosexual, okay? Not to disparage the metrosexual man. I'm just saying it sounds very, very soft and gentle, right? And yet Paul says that this is what God is like, and I'm supposed to be that. And I sometimes have this like, what does it look like in a man to be this way? And so here's what I did. I know that Jesus is God, okay? And so I thought, I'm going to see how he lived out these characteristics. If these are God characteristics, I know Jesus is God, so how did he live out all these characteristics? And so I took 2 afternoons, and I read through the Gospel of Mark, which is a biography of Jesus written by Mark. And here's, I'm not going to give you everything I saw, but here's some of the things that I saw. I saw that Jesus was loved by God, so he was affirmed by God the Father. I saw that Jesus was defiant in the face of religious leaders who tried to shut him down. They basically said, you can't talk. He's like, I'm going to talk. I saw that he didn't do his work in secret, even though there were critics watching. There were all kinds of skeptics watching him saying, you can't do that. He's like, well, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyways, right? I saw that Jesus confronted slander. I saw that he was not afraid of a crazy, strong, demon-possessed man. I see he did not get distracted when people made fun of him. I see he did not always entertain people who wanted to argue. Sometimes he just said, I'm done with this conversation. I saw that he knew tough times were coming, but he kept going, much like a Navy SEAL would do on an operation. Jesus called people to make hard decisions. He powerfully took control of scenarios that left others confused and scared. He looked people in the eye and said really tough things. He ran to problems. He stood up against the abuse of poor people so strongly that he scared his critics away. He stood nose to nose with his enemies and they backed down. He didn't care about being politically correct, and he did not back away from people who tried to hurt him. He called his followers to rugged sacrifice and promised them sufficient resources. He stood up for those being criticized by harsh religious people. He was strong even when he was betrayed by a friend. He did not flinch or cower when he was arrested and lied against. He prayed for forgiveness for those who betrayed him, lied about him, and ultimately killed him, and he died like a man. And I read all this stuff and I'm like, whoa, that is the essence of manhood. He's strong, he's truthful, he's tough, he doesn't back away when he's confronted, and he's also love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And when I read that Jesus was all these things, and I see how he lived out all these things, all of a sudden I'm believing now that these are the characteristics of the greatest man who ever lived. And I want to prayerfully and consistently develop these characteristics in my life, in my home, and I want our church. I believe this is what a place that is filled with godly people should look like. And so what we want to do for the next 5 weeks is we're going to explore. We're going to take 2 at a time. This week we're going to talk about love, and next week we're going to talk about joy and peace. Next week, patience and kindness, goodness and faithfulness. And we're going to explore what it will look like if each one of us begins to make this our way of life, so that when people, if they were to ever talk about Church 180 and they were to ask the question, what's it like around there? We could begin by describing it as a place of love. And we're going to explore what that means, all right? So, Jesus told his followers, he said, look, this is something that's important, so I want you to know this. He said, your love for one another will prove to the world that you're my disciples. Like, this is what makes you different from anyone else, right? It's not the t-shirt that you wear. It's not your bumper sticker. It's not the radio station that you listen to. It's not even the fact that you go to church every Sunday. What makes you different from everyone else is the way that you love one another. And then St. Paul said, he said, I love this. This is really good. Look at this. He said, don't just pretend to love others. Stop for a minute. You ever done that? I mean, no, we all have, okay? All right, okay. But he said don't do that. Don't just pretend to love others. Really love them. Love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. And then St. Peter came along and said, you must show sincere love to each other as brothers and sisters. Love each other deeply with all your heart. So, love is absolutely a defining characteristic. I mean, if you read through the descriptions of the early church, if you read through the things that Jesus said and Paul wrote and James wrote and John wrote and the apostles, you read through the words they use to describe the church is absolutely a place that is distinguished by the way we love one another. But there's something about love. It's not something you get and that's it. So it's not like you walk through the doors of the church, someone gives you a bag of love, boom, you've got love, you're good. That'd be awesome, wouldn't it? You don't drink a can of love and you're in, right? It's not like Red Bull. You drink Red Bull and you're awake, right? It's not like that with love. Love evolves. It looks different for everyone and from everyone. So for instance, I'm going to explain this a little bit more in just a minute, but I will love my wife differently than I will love you if it's the first time I've met you. And by the way, I'll never love you the way I love my wife, right? Just let's get that out of the way, okay? Love is something that's continually evolving, and our capacity for love over time gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Let me show you. St. Paul wrote a letter to a bunch of Christians in the city of Thessalonica. It's in our Bible called Thessalonians. And he said this. He said, look, we don't need to write to you about the importance of loving each other. For God himself has taught you to love one another. In other words, you get it. Like, God is teaching you. You just kind of are getting it. Like, when we give ourselves to Christ, he moves in. He helps us to love one another in supernatural ways. And that's what Paul said. He said, indeed, you already show your love for all the believers throughout Macedonia. In other words, like, you're doing it. Like, you are loving one another. Good for you. And then he says this. Even so, dear brothers and sisters, we urge you to love them even more. So he's looking at the church and saying, hey guys, you love one another. And so I would just say this to you. Like, I think our church is a little odd. in that we don't have a lot of problems. Like there's not a lot of infighting. There's not a lot of gossiping. There's just not that kind. I mean, it's a really cool thing, and I see love happening in our church, and it's a wonderful thing. But I would just say to you, like the apostle said to the other church, let's love one another even more. That's what's expected of us as believers. Our capacity for love continues to increase. And then earlier in this same letter, Paul writing to the Thessalonians, he said, "May the Lord make your love for one another and for all people," read this with me, please, "grow and overflow just as our love for you overflows." And this really is the goal, to be filled with love, so much love that it just kind of drips, it kind of leaks on other people as they walk by. Normally that's kind of gross, right? But can you imagine like having love leak on you? That would be a great thing. And that's what's supposed to be true the church. So I'm reading all this and I'm like, what is love? Like, let's just do this. Let's just take just a second. Like, get your best definition in mind. Turn to the person seated next to you and tell them your definition of love in 5 seconds. Ready, set, go. Okay. So, all right. So here's the question. Like, what does love look like? So I love, so in August, Sherry and I will be married 20 years. I am still absolutely smitten by that girl. She got a new haircut yesterday, and I can't stop looking at her. It's insane. I just absolutely adore her. But we'll be married 20 years in August, and I absolutely love Sherry. So should I treat you that way? I mean, would you like me to kiss you in the morning? Good morning? Would that be weird or what, huh? I mean, how about do you want me to text you all throughout the day? Do you want me to do your dishes? No, I'm not going to do that. That's a bad question, all right? So, I love my wife I just love her, right? So if I love you, should I do everything for you that I do for her? And I love my kids. And so if I say I love you, should I do everything for you that I do for them? I love Jim Ockenfels, that wonderful man who stood up here this morning. I love him. Should I do everything for you that I do for him? So this question of love, how do we love one another? And it's an important question, right? Because Jesus said it's the one thing that sets you apart from everybody else in the world, the way you love one another. So how do I treat someone that I love? It's really a simple answer. But it's one that's going to take great effort and one that we'll spend the rest of our lives getting better at. Really simple answer. Here's how we treat one another with love. And quite frankly, we must do this in the church, and we ought to do it in our homes. And quite frankly, if you're a Christian, you must do it in your home as well. These are the teachings of Jesus, and we believe in him, and we follow his teachings, everything changes. It gets wonderful. Look, here's how Jesus, in one of his most famous teachings, said that we love one another. You ready? Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is how we treat one another with love, right? So if I love someone, this is how I will treat them. But there's still this question. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Some of you are like, what was that? Oh, gosh. All right, so, sometimes that stuff pops in my head and I do it and it's not funny. That was kind of funny. All right. So, all right, I know how I treat someone with love, but still the question is, what exactly does love look like? So St. Paul answers that question where probably most of us have probably heard this answer. It's in 1 Corinthians 13. This is what he says. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. So let's apply Jesus' teaching to St. Paul's teaching. Would you like me to be patient with you? Then you ought to be patient with me. Would you like me to be kind to you? Then you ought to be kind to me. Would you like me to be jealous about you? Would you like me to, every time I'm around you, tell you how awesome I am and tell you how big my fish that I caught was, and every time you start to tell a story, I try to outtell your story? Would you like me to do that to you? Then you ought to do that to me. Ought not to do that to me, right? Right, so Paul says love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. Jesus said, listen, here's how we treat one another with love. I will do for you what I want you to do for me. I want you to love me. I want you to be patient with me. I want you to be kind with me. I don't want you to be jealous of me. I don't want you to boast around me. I don't want you to be proud around me or be rude to me. So guess what? If I'm going to treat you with love, I'm going to do that to you. Now, can you imagine if just all of us in this room begin to just do this to one another? And we begin to do that to people who walk into our church. And we begin to do that in our homes. And we begin to do that in our workplaces. But Paul's not done. He says, love does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wrong. Hey, would you like for me to do things your way without being cranky all the time? Would you like me to comply? And we could ask this, ought to ask this question about our homes. Every husband ought to look at his wife and say, would you like me to do it your way sometimes without fussing and arguing and cursing under my breath? Would you like that? Then you ought to do that to me. And wives ought to say the same things to husbands, because that's how we love one another, right? Would you like it if every time I mess up, you remind me of the previous time I messed up? No, you wouldn't. So don't do that for me, right? This is love. Paul says love does not demand its own way. It's not irritable. It's not cranky. Keeps no record of being wronged. And Jesus says, look, here's the way we treat one another with love. I do for you what I want you to do for me. Paul goes on. He says, love does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever truth wins out. Would you like me to celebrate when bad things happen to you? Yeah. Then don't do that to me, right? What if we begin to apply this in our home? And then Paul says this, look, love never gives up, it never loses faith, it's always hopeful, and it endures through every circumstance. Again, let me just ask some questions. Do you want me to keep believing in you even when the chips are down? Then do that for me. Do you want me to continue to be hopeful for you even when it looks like you've really blown it this time? Then do that for me. And what would happen as a church if we begin to look at one another in this light? Hey, you know what I want? I want to be treated with patience and kindness. I don't want you always to be cranky and irritable. I don't want you to remind me every time I messed up that this is the third time I've messed up. Just love me, and then I did that for you. Really, it comes down to this. People who really love one another will say this: I'll do for you what I want you to do for me. And I'll do it even if you never do it back. I'll treat you with patience and kindness and goodness, and I'll celebrate when good things happen to you, and I'll never give up, and I'll always be hopeful for you, even if you don't do it for me. And you know why we do that? Because our Savior, Jesus Christ, modeled the way. He loves people even when they don't love Him in return. Let me just tell you something. You create an environment like that, and that's better than awesome music, which we have. That's better than really cool lights, which we have. You can create a really awesome environment. I think you can fill a building without Jesus, right? You can fill a building without Jesus. But what you can't do is create an environment of love like this without Jesus. And when you have that kind of an environment of love, where we're doing for one another as we would have done unto ourselves, we're patient with one another, kind with one another, we never give up on one another, that kind of an environment is absolutely winsome, and that's the kind of environment where people who do not yet know Jesus will most likely become engaged. They'll say, I don't believe everything you believe, but that's winsome, that's engaging. Now, this can get crazy really quick, because not everyone, even in this room, not everyone's in the same place emotionally or spiritually. I mean, some people had a great home environment when you grew up. I mean, you saw love modeled really, really well. And so when Jesus talks about love, you're like, I get it. I know what it looks like because my parents did that. But then there are others, and probably even in this room, who grew up in a dysfunctional environment where anger and bitterness and harshness were normal. And so when we say things like, I'll do for you what you want me to do for me, basically your thing is like, just don't yell at me. So I would simply say, I think this is a brilliant definition that Jesus gives us. If you don't want to be yelled at, don't yell. Right? Start with what you have. Start loving with what you have. Start with what you know, and the Spirit of Jesus inside of you will begin to enhance your capacity to love. Now, let me just say this. Because we all come from different backgrounds and all of our stories are different, what you want may not be what you need. What I want may not be what I need. I mean, as I mature spiritually, as I mature emotionally, we begin to realize that sometimes we need things that are not fun, but are really good for me. Sometimes I need someone to correct me. Not a big fan of that, but sometimes I need it. And if you love me, you'll do it for me, yes? Sometimes I need someone to say no to me. Not a big fan of that, again. But if you love me, you'll do it for me. Sometimes I need someone to challenge me. Sometimes I need someone to teach me. In other words, love isn't always rainbows and lollipops. Aren't you glad you came to church? Sometimes we have a tendency to think, if you love me, you'll always be nice to me. If you love me, you'll always say yes. If you love me, you'll always let me have my way. If you love me, you'll let me do whatever I want. That's not true. Sometimes love is tough. And sometimes love requires tough words. But even when love is tough, it's always the best thing. So, for instance, let me just illustrate to you. Within this last week, I can think of a few times that I've had to say some tough things to people that I really, really, really love. My 6 kids. I've had to say, no more candy. I admit that's pretty mean. I've had to say, you have to go to bed now. So my 7-year-old has this really cute thing. I've always told my girls, if you roll puppy eyes at me, it's immediately no. Like, I will never be influenced by your puppy eyes, and I am hard like that. I'm not influenced by puppy eyes. And the reason I had to say that was because I'm not hard like that. I can be influenced by puppy eyes. So I told him, as soon as you roll puppy eyes, we're done immediately no. So my 7-year-old is brilliant. She doesn't roll puppy eyes. She now says this to me, Dad, you don't want to let me down, do you? Right. So I've amended my rule to include that line, right? Because sometimes I love her enough to let her down. Sometimes I love my kids enough to think about their future. And so I have to say hard things in the present. That's love. As I mature and grow spiritually and emotionally, I begin to realize that sometimes what I want someone to do for me is something hard. Last Sunday, I had a lady in our church. She came to me. She felt like I spoke a word out of season, and she addressed me. And it was a wonderful gift to me. She confronted me with a very gentle and loving spirit. And what I need as a man, what I need as a Christian, what I need as a pastor is someone in a family who will love and sometimes do some hard things. And I told her, I said, if you start doing this every Sunday, you're going to quickly lose credibility, right? You're just nitpicking, right? But it was an appropriate word to me. And I need that. And you need that. And it's not always fun, but love does what's good and what's best. And it acts in a way, As I get mature spiritually and as I mature emotionally, sometimes I realize I need things for me that are not always pleasant, but that are the best for my future. And so because I love others, I must too give them when and if appropriate. Does that make sense? So just think about this. Like, how awesome would your home be if you lived with love? I'll do for you what you want me to do for you. How awesome would your workplace be if you lived with love? I'll do for you what I want you to do for me. How awesome would our church be if we all embrace this idea of I'll do for you what I want you to do for me? Now, let me just tell us, and at the end, at the end of the talk today, I'm just going to take a few minutes. If you want to text in some questions, we're going to throw a number up on the screen, and we'll field 5 or 6 questions, and then we'll go beat the Baptist to Mose. Fair enough? Now, some of us in this room should love better than others. If the Spirit of God is living in you, it's an expectation. It's an expectation that you ought to love other people if the Spirit of God is living in you. And we also expect that you'll get better at loving others. In other words, if you've been a Christian for years and you're still a curmudgeon, something's wrong. Can you say curmudgeon? It's a great word, curmudgeon. Does someone come to mind when you say it? Yeah, okay. Hopefully not the person next to you, right? That's not a good thing. But listen to me. The church is to be that place where we love one another deeply. So here's a question. How do we get this kind of love? Some of us is hard to naturally love. And then how do we grow this kind of love? So St. Paul says this. He said, look, he's just going to give us a basic lesson about humanity. This is what he says. When you follow the natural desires of your sinful nature, in other words, when you do what comes naturally, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery. Now listen, most of my life I've not had to try to do those things. Those things came naturally, right? When I do whatever I want, when I do what feels good, like those things are very natural. Paul says, when you follow your natural desires, these will be the results. He goes on. Hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like this. When you do what comes naturally, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen. And quite frankly, let's be honest, lots of workplaces are filled with things like this. Is it not true? Right? Lots of homes are filled with this, right? And what's worse is lots of churches are filled with this. And it should not be. This should never be descriptive of the church of Jesus Christ. And it cannot be descriptive of our church. Paul says, listen, those things happen when we function by just doing what comes naturally. But, look at this. The Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in us. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This kind of characteristic is the result of Jesus living inside of us. The Bible says when we believe in Jesus, His Spirit actually moves inside of us, and He begins making everything new. It's like an extreme makeover. What used to come naturally was immorality, was anger, was selfishness, was hostility, was division. All that stuff came, and I didn't even have to try to produce it. Right? Am I the only one in here feeling that way? Okay. All right. And then Jesus came in, and now this kind of stuff is starting to happen. Sherry said something to me that was so cool the other day. I love my bride, and she does not pass out compliments like candy. So if she gives you a compliment, it's like, it's spot on. I mean, I've tried to solicit compliments. Doesn't work. She said to me the other day, and this is really cool. She said, I've seen you grow more in the last 6 months than I've seen you grow in years. Now, listen, here's why. Because all of a sudden there's a spiritual awakening in my heart that says, I really, really, really need Jesus. And I'm really, really, really pursuing Him. And He is making a difference. And you know it's legit because Mrs. Peterson said so. Now, all I'm just saying is like, this stuff is not natural for us. It's not natural for me. It's not natural for most of us. And for some of us, it's going to take longer, depending on your family history, your experiences. But God begins to grow these kinds of things in us: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. He begins, as we pursue Him, He begins to grow these things in us. But there's more to it. I can't just sit back, eat Little Debbie's and watch Netflix and let God grow love. That sucks, doesn't it? It'd be awesome if we could do that. But it doesn't work like that. God moves inside of us with His Spirit. He begins to grow this capacity to love. But I've got choices to make. Multiple times, every day, I have to make this decision. I have to answer this question: will I do for you what I want you to do for me? Will I be patient with you? Or will I yell? Will I do your things your way without complaining? Or will I be bitter and whine and hostile? Will I keep hoping for you? Or will I write you off? See, the Spirit of God is planting and nurturing love inside of you, but you have a choice to make. And that is this: will I act loving? And so what happens when you don't? Well, you do what I did last night. You apologize. I was tired. I was grumpy. In-laws are in town. That has nothing to do with it, but they're in town. I blamed Sherry for something that was not her fault. And I didn't actually look a lot like Jesus when I did it. And then I realized, crap, I got to talk about love today, right? So I confessed I was not nice, and I'm sorry, and I asked her to forgive me. And then I had to do the same thing again this morning. I don't know what the scoop is, but this is what we do when we're seeking to make decisions that look like love. Sometimes we miss it. Can I get a witness? And when you miss it, Christians ought to be really good at saying, I'm sorry. In fact, we just should try it right now. Why don't we give it a whirl? Everybody here, ready? 3, 2, 1, I'm sorry. How'd that feel? Let's do it again. Ready? 3, 2, 1, I'm sorry. And that's what we do. And if you want to, you can just say, I really mean it, and that would count for your apology, right? Look, around here in the church, we are to love one another. And I'm just going to let me just talk now as your pastor, all right? We are not terrible at loving one another. We actually do pretty good. But we can and we ought to get better. And so let me give you some very practical ways, all right? Let me give you 2. You know, when you go to any place for the first time, it's kind of weird. You walk in, you're like, I don't know anybody, and I don't know what they do. It's even weirder at church when you walk in for the first time. You walk in, you don't know anybody. You don't know if they're going to be weird. You don't know how long the preacher's going to preach. We've had some really long sermons lately. Can I get a witness? I'm going to try to cut it down a little bit, all right? But you just don't know, so you walk into church. Listen, what do you want when you walk into the building for the first time? What do you want? Coffee. We have a great coffee team. Thank you, guys. Right? Don't you want to be acknowledged? Somebody see you, notice you, say hey. So last Sunday we had a guy here, first time ever, right? His son brought him for Father's Day. And he was here, and he was alone and lingering by himself. And so I went over and talked to him. And I talked to him so long that it was starting to get weird. So I thought, well, I probably ought to back out, right? Because I got nothing left to say. And I backed out, and I'm just going to shoot straight with you guys. He spent the rest of the morning alone. And I thought, guys, we can do better than this, right? There's a guy checking our church for the first time, and he should not be alone, right? Because in this environment, the one thing we do better than anyone in the world is love. And you know what love does? It does for you, what I would want you to do for me. And if I'm walking into an organization or a church for the first time, the one thing I don't want to do is feel weird and out of place and just standing around, trying to look like I belong when everybody clearly knows I don't. Right? And so I would say to all of us in this room, one of the easiest things we could do to make an environment where it's loving is to simply observe. Is there someone here who looks like they just need a high five, or hey, my name is Paul, or can I get you a cup of coffee, or something like that? Love, because that's what it's like around here. Ask yourself this. What would I want if I were in her shoes or his shoes? What other practical illustration? And I love you. Do you know that I love you? Okay. Pick your trash up after church. It's not nice to leave empty coffee cups and water bottles laying around. Would you want someone to do that for you? Right? You still love me? Okay. But pick your trash up after church. But it gets, honestly, guys, it gets deeper than that. Are you willing to love someone who comes into our church who doesn't get it? Are you willing to love someone who doesn't know, or doesn't understand, or doesn't believe the way that you do, doesn't look the way that you do, who might walk in and come in with someone that you would never come in with? So, Rob and Jennifer have recently started coming to our church. They came to our church about 7 years ago. And they reminded me when they were here that I had quoted a song by Toby Keith. Anyone know Toby Keith? And that song stuck with them. And I was describing in that sermon 7 years ago the way our church ought to be. And I thought, I haven't changed, and I don't think the church ought to have changed at all. And so the song by Toby Keith, this is Toby Keith if you don't know him, it's called I Love This Bar. And I'm not going to sing it to you. I would love to, but I won't. But I'm going to read the lyrics to you, okay? This is what he thinks about his bar. We've got winners, we've got losers. Chain smokers and boozers, we've got yuppies, we've got bikers, we've got some thirsty hitchhikers, and the girl next door, she dresses up like a movie star. I love this bar. We got cowboys, we got truckers, broken-hearted fools and suckers. We got hustlers, we got fighters, early birds and all-nighters. The veterans, they talk about their battle scars. I love this bar. Then he goes in his chorus. I love this bar. It's my kind of place. Just walking through the front door puts a big smile on my face. It ain't too far. Come as you are. I love this bar. And then he says this. I've seen short skirts. We've got high techs, blue-collar boys and rednecks. We've got lovers, lots of lookers. I've seen dancing girls and hookers. I love this bar. It's my kind of place. Just walking through the front door puts a big smile on my face. It ain't too far. Come as you are. Say it with me. I love this bar. That is an unbelievable description of how the Church of Jesus Christ ought to look. If in this room everyone looks like you and thinks like you and believes like you and acts like you, that's not a church. That's a privileged club. The church ought to be filled with people who might even make you a little nervous. The church ought to be filled with people who do not look like you, who have not had similar life experiences. And what the church should offer, that Toby Keith's bar offers, is this: come as you are. And you know what breaks my heart is that I see bars doing this all the time, but I see churches doing this. But not our church. Round here, we're going to love. Round here, we're going to say, you know what I would want? If I walked into your place, I would want you to smile at me. Round here, we're going to say, what I would want if I walked into your place is that you would serve me a cup of coffee, regardless of whether or not I walk in by myself, whether I walk in with someone who I'm married to, or whether I walk in hand with someone of the same sex. Round here, we say, we're going to love you. Amen? As a church, we should expect that we will have all kinds of people. Gay people, straight people, believers, agnostics, addicts, Republicans, Democrats, and non-voters. Listen, U2, you know who U2 is? You know who U2 is. Had a concert this week. You know what Bono said when he stood up in front of thousands of people? This is what he said. It doesn't matter how you voted, you're welcome here. If Bono can say it, why can't we say it? We are going to say it, right? Because round here we love. It doesn't matter if you're young or you're old, you're black, you're white, you drove in or you rode in. This is a place where Sunday looks like Monday, except that it's filled with love. People should expect to be loved when they walk in here. They should expect to be smiled at, talked to, and hugged. Every Sunday morning, our volunteers get together. We have this silly acronym. We'd say, every volunteer is a star. 4 actions we ask all of our volunteers to do. Smile at people, touch appropriately, right? This morning we had this conversation, and they're like, yeah, no butt smacks as they're walking out. Hey, good game today, buddy, right? That's not appropriate. Ask questions, answer questions, and finally repeat. Do it again. Do it at the end, right? Everyone should be loved, invited to participate, invited to be a part of this, because that's what you would want. And so we must do it for others because that's what love does. We love one another, and love says this. Read this with me, please. I'll do for you what I want you to do for me. That's what Jesus did, and that's what he calls his church to do. And every single one of us in this room that is a believer in Jesus Christ has an obligation to do it. And let me just tell you this. I think we have an obligation to hold one another accountable to this. So if we see one of our own, a Christian in this room, acting in ways that are unloving, that are hostile, that are bitter, that are complaining, that are impatient, we have this expectation to gently speak into one another's life. Is that right? Because we love one another. We want to represent Jesus to the world. Now, let's take a few questions, and then I'm going to turn this service back over to our host team. The number is going to be on the screen. All right, 803-207-1978. We're going to take a couple questions here. I'm going to just say a word of prayer, and then you can text in some questions. We'll take 5 or 6, and we'll go. Father, I pray that our church will be a place where love is normal, where we just do for other people what we would want done for us. When a stranger walks in, we love them. When a stranger walks in, we welcome them, regardless of what their story is, regardless of what they look like. God, I pray that our church will be different because of the way we love. We don't want to be a place that's hostile. We don't want to be a place that's reclusive. We don't want to be a place that's introverted. We want to be wide arms open with love so that people can know Jesus, be transformed. And so, God, we're going to just take a couple of moments. And I pray that in these next couple of moments, if there are questions, God, you'll help us to engage them well, to explain what loving culture looks like. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Let me take just a couple minutes and do this, all right? Question number 1. If we as Christians have to love, how can I love someone that I cannot forgive hurting me in the past? If we as Christians have to love, how can I love someone that I cannot forgive hurting me in the past? I actually heard a great conversation the other day. Someone said, we always talk about forgive and forget. That's really that's not a first of all, it's not possible. Secondly, it's not even necessarily biblical. it's I forgive you, and I choose to function from this point forward in light of that forgiveness. So, for instance, if someone has sexually abused me, I will forgive you, but I will function from this point forward with the awareness that I'm not going to put myself or my children in that environment. If someone has spoken a harsh word to you, it's forgiving them and functioning from this point forward in light of that forgiveness. And let me just tell you this. I think, remember in 9/11 when the plane went down, Todd Beamer, he's the guy that said, "Let's roll." You guys remember that? Someone asked his wife about a year after the fact, they said, "Have you forgiven the men who killed your husband?" And she said, "Not yet, but I'm working on it." And sometimes I think that's a beautiful expression to just the honesty there. Working, praying, and moving towards forgiveness. And so I would just say there are some of you in this room probably that have experienced things that it would be almost disrespectful for someone to say to you, "Just forgive it," and just dismiss it that quickly. Some things are really significant and substantive. I personally am working through some things right now in my own life. I'm really wrestling with just anger and sadness over some things, and I'm desperately seeking God to help me understand what it looks like to live in forgiveness, right? And so I just would say, I take that question seriously and would just encourage you to at least begin the conversation in prayer with God. I'm struggling here to forgive. Please help me to be able to forgive, and watch what begins to happen in the heart that fully pursues God, okay? That may have not been as concise answer as what you're hoping for, but that's what I'm experiencing right now, all right? How do I love in an overpopulated world where if you show love to everyone, you'll get taken advantage of? Does that make sense? That's a good question. The best answer I've ever heard on this is do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. So I can't feed the world, but I can feed one person, right? I can't sit down and talk with everyone, but I can sit down and talk with my neighbor, listen to my neighbor, right? So that bit of counsel for me has been incredibly helpful. Do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. And another thing for me has been huge, like just realizing I'm not Jesus. And there's some people that I don't have the capacity to help. I just don't have the capacity, right? And so the good news is I can be patient with them. I can be kind. I can be gentle. I can continue to believe for and pray for, but realizing that Jesus is going to use someone else in that healing capacity or helping capacity, all right? Here's another one. You spoke about loving your kids enough to say no to them. How do you know if and when it comes to that? And does this kind of love come into play between adults and a mentoring type of relationship? And okay, so if I understand this question correctly, they're asking: when is it appropriate to say no to another adult? Proverbs 19:19 is really important scripture. Proverbs 19:19 says, if you help an angry man once, you'll have to help him again. And you can replace that anger with any dysfunctional behavior. If you help a man who won't pay his bills but takes all his money and buys new shoes or a new phone, if you pay his bills, you're going to have to do it again. At some point, if you keep helping dysfunctional behavior, you're going to keep having to do it, and the individual with dysfunctional behavior will never learn his lesson. So the most loving thing you can do is let him learn the lesson, right? Right? Yeah. I would just encourage you to read the book Boundaries. There's an incredible answers, incredible wisdom in that book, Boundaries, about realizing when we say no to individuals in a relationship and how helpful that can be. All right, here's what we're going to do. We are going to, I'm going to invite the host team up, and we are going to, we're going to pray. Jesus, help us to love well. Thanks for our host team. Thank you for our band. Thank you for every man and woman in this church. I pray that we'll all press really, really, really hard into God, and that you will teach us, Lord, to love well in our church, in our homes, in our workplace. In Jesus' name, amen.